Hello and welcome back to the MCAT grind. This is a very short chapter about respiratory system because it's the pretty much like smallest section on the MCAT. However, you will see one discrete question, very likely, and it will probably be about this. You might see this from a general chem chapter because it does overlap with that Le Chantelier's principle of higher concentration or partial pressure in one will cause a shift and wanting to balance it out into the equilibrium state. So it will go ahead and boom, move the yield either to the left or to the right. Now, biology chapter 6, respiratory system mostly talks about the structure of lungs. We all know that we have our lungs, and when we have our lungs, we want to breathe in, we want to expand our chest cavity, and we use that through our diaphragm. It is innervated by the skeletal muscle, although breathing is under autonomic control. Skeletal muscle is the one that is, what a diaphragm is being used. So, although it's autonomic breathing, we still use the skeletal muscle, which is active muscle movement in part of the somatic division, to innervate the diaphragm movements. So we also have external intercostal muscles, and that will allow the further expansion of the chest cavity. Also, the internal intercostal muscles to help squish in the chest cavity to help expel the air out. Now, what we have is the expansion of diaphragm allows the balloon to get bigger, and that generates a negative pressure. So the outside air will flow in through the mouth, into the trachea, and then into the bronchi, bronchioles, and ultimately the alveoli will be filled up with air. The gas exchange occurs because there's a higher concentration of O2 relative to inside, and there's a higher concentration of CO2 inside rather than outside, so it will diffuse down the respective gradients. And you can tell the O2 from outside will fill up the alveoli and diffuse out into the bloodstream, and the CO2 in the bloodstream will diffuse into the alveoli and then be moved out and about. When you breathe in, the oxygen on the outside is about 20-ish%, and the air you breathe out is about 16% saturated with oxygen. So we only really take up 4 or 5% of the oxygen we breathe in. That's not how percentage works. 4 out of 5% out of 20, that's about 20 to 25% of the oxygen we take in actual use. That's why CPR breathing works so well, because the air you breathe out still contains a relatively good amount of oxygen. Anyway, I've went off topic, but here is your total lung capacity, which is the maximum volume of air in your lungs, all the way down to the maximum, basically just the maximum volume of air in your lungs. But when you breathe in, you're filling up to the top, but when you breathe out, there's always going to be a little bit of air left in your lungs to keep your alveoli from collapsing onto itself, right? Think about them as little balls. What happens when you close the walls together? Well, they're going to stick together and they'll die. So you don't want the walls to be touching each other. You want to leave some bit of space together in like the balloon. Okay? So the residual volume is reserved for to make the alveoli don't close completely. And of course we have our tidal volume, which is how we breathe normally without any extra exertion. Now, if we want, we could breathe in all the way in. And the excess ones from our tidal volume are inspiratory reserve volume. The reserve volume you can do to breathe in a lot more of. We also have the counterpart, the expiratory reserve volume. So when you're breathing out normally, but when you want to forcibly breathe out using your interior costal muscles to contract it together, you go, right? There's that extra volume you can blow out, and that's much less. Okay, and the vital capacity is the maximum breathe you can breathe in to the maximum you can breathe out. All the way. Remember interior costal muscles for expulsion of air, and exterior intercostal muscles for expelling the air. I know it's kind of switcheroo, but I like to think that when you want to breathe in, you use your outside muscles of your ribs to the outside muscles to help contract and boom, expand it out. And when you expel, you want to use the interior inside closer to your lung to squeeze together and squeeze in towards your chest to squeeze it out. That's how I remember. Alright, now look at this equation, or this general, using a carbonate to help regulate the acidity in our bloodstream. We have CO2, H2O, C2CO3, H, and HCO3. Now, carbonic anhydrase is the enzyme responsible to help regulate using this medium, H2CO3, and you can see how CO2 comes into play. The more CO2 we have in our bloodstream, it will go ahead and trigger the medulla oblongata in our midbrain to stimulate more breathing, because there's way too many CO2 in our body, and that results in higher acidity because there are higher protons in our bloodstream. So that stimulates to breathe more, as in like go breathe in, breathe out more, increase the frequency, and it will blow out more CO2. When we breathe out more CO2, this goes down, and as a result, more of here is moved over to compensate for that loss in CO2. You can also see if we are losing H2O, our breathing rate will also slow down a little bit to reserve it, but that's not such a big deal of the water we're losing. Mostly it's done by the kidney actions to help save and conserve water. Our body typically keeps it at around 7.35 to 7.45 pH level, and you will experience an maybe extra acidity if you go below 7.35, and that's because there's more protons in your bloodstream. Now, we have what's called the Bohr curve, and we'll look at this a bit more in the circulatory system unit, but generally a right shift to the curve is for lowering in hemoglobin affinity for oxygen. Normally, hemoglobin is the substance to bind oxygen with, and when they're at the tissue, they want to unload the oxygen, right? I should add one more. Also 6-BPG. Also bisphospho something. Also help induce the oxygen release unload at the tissue, right? If you ever seen cells at work, they have to drop off the oxygen boxes, and if they deliver that oxygen, then they can pick up the extra waste CO2 and bring it back to the lungs. Now what happens here is if there's an increase in temperature or there's a low pH, increase in CO2 at the tissues, right? That's where they're delivering to. It will cause the hemoglobin to decrease in affinity and for the oxygen, and thus promote the unloading of the oxygen. Now remember, we also have the cooperative binding of hemoglobin to oxygen. So if one subunit of the hemoglobin unloads the oxygen, then the other ones also loses their affinity eventually, more and more, right? Also, we can think of the other way around. Now, fetal hemoglobin, which is like the baby hemoglobin, has a higher affinity for O2, so they're more to the left because they want to bind the O2 more than their mother and uptake the oxygen for their development. And what else? Right, yeah, so you'll see the respiratory system works very closely with circulatory system because the blood that is pulmonary artery goes towards the lungs to get oxygenated, and then they will go back through pulmonary vein to the heart through the left atrium, and that's where they will then get pulsed through the heart and get pumped through the rest of the body. It's the only instance where the artery and the vein are reversed due to their oxygen content. The artery is the one that doesn't have oxygen, deoxygenated, and the pulmonary vein is the one that's oxygenated because it came back from the lungs. All right, that's it. Take care.